Hey there friends, Dave Paulides, CanAm Missing Project, copyrighted edition of our video page, and Huck's in the building. She's been sleeping while I've been preparing this, and she's been hanging out all day, being a lazy day because it's so cold outside. Yeah, she's a good girl. So we are going to have a very interesting missing person case today. And I first want to thank somebody who sent us a gift in the mail. They sent us a little Bigfoot figurine and some treats for Huck, but there was no note in it. And it came from Amazon. And again, I don't like to take things without giving the due thank you, but whoever you were, thank you. I appreciate it. Huck will appreciate it. Every once in a while, I'll get contacted by a victim's family. And I've told you before, I don't solicit them. If they call me, I'm all in. I'll engage them to any extent possible. And just recently, a young man who disappeared in water, their family contacted me. And I sent him Missing 411, a sobering coincidence, because I said, hey, you want to read this. And you'll want to understand the similarity in your son's case to these cases. And I can't even imagine her having to sit down and read them. But I just got a response from her, said she read the book and she was astounded how many cases were identical. Yeah. And then she asked me for my opinion on that. And that's a tough one, because on the cases in the water, there's something unusual going on. Do I have any proof of what is going on? No, I don't. Other than they're all just cookie cutter cases of each other. And Huck, what's up? Huh? What's up? She's walking around the room checking everything out. Now she's got one of her toys in the corner. Yeah, that's my dog. And many of you have said things about Huck. They're just about all true. She's been a bright spot in my life. Dogs are a real special thing. And if you don't have one, if you've never had one, I would suggest that maybe you go down to your local pond and you offer to care for one for a weekend and just see what it's like. And understand how much love they give back. Because until you had one, it's really hard to believe. And every dog breed is different. And do your research. Some are real smart. Some aren't so smart. She's super smart. And yeah, can't say enough about dogs. So let's talk about missing people. First case involves an incident in England. So we talked about cases in Australia, the US, Canada, and now we're in England. Almost the exact same path I followed when I started research missing 411 cases. Do I think these are related? Oh yes, 100%. So does it surprise me that we're in England? Not a bit. Now, this incident happened just north of Liverpool in a town called Hightown. This is Manchester, UK. Manchester, I've written about and I've talked about it a lot. They had somebody there they called the Manchester Pusher. Never saw him push anybody. Never saw a person get pushed. No ID, no description on this person. But people kept ending up in the canals in Manchester dead, floating, and in most of those canals you could stand up in them. So figure that one out. Very strange place. Cases that match, sobering coincidence. So Hightown, England. This man, John Lucy, 50 years old, missing November 14th, 1936. He was a business owner. He owned a company called Milton Cooperage in Liverpool. He was described as very well off. He resided with his wife, his son 18, his daughter 16, in a town called Irby and Wirral. He liked to ride horses. And on November 14th, he went to a Hightown area and he visited his cousin, a man named William Lucy, who was the owner of the Blundell Sands, yeah, I said that right, riding school. Now, John would go down there, rent a horse, ride it on the beach, and was a good horseman. Well, on that day, came out, talked to his cousin, said, yeah, I'm going to take a horse out for an hour or so. Took the horse out, and about an hour later, the horse returned without John on it. Never happened before. Well, William organized a search party with some stable boys, and they went down and they followed the path John would have taken from the stable down to the beach, and they looked around. Well, one of the things that his cousin William found is that they looked all over the beach and they didn't find any area where they thought somebody fell off of a horse. Make a big divot in the sand, make a big mark, you'd see people walking around on the sand. There was none of that. But they searched into the night, and late into the night, far down the beach, they found a hat. It's called a trilby, Trilby, that was right at the water line, and it was very similar to what John was wearing when he left on the horse. Well, they all came back, and they hadn't found him other than this hat. They contacted John's wife. She said, well, I was supposed to meet him tonight at the cinema in Liverpool, but instead she came to the stables. And she identified the hat that was found as belonging to John's. And she said, well, where is he? And they said, we have no idea. We've talked to people in town. Nobody saw him walk through town. I don't think he fell off the horse in the sand because there was no marks in the sand. The horse doesn't have any injury. And he doesn't appear as though anything happened to the reins, nothing broke, etc. Well, she said one time a couple years ago, John disappeared for a day. She never gave any specifics about it. But then he came back and he had amnesia for a while and it cleared up, and she never thought much more about it. And in her mind, she started to think, I wonder if this is a case of amnesia. Nobody really knew. So what you have, a very wealthy business owner missing next to the ocean. Kids, wife, business associates, cousin, nobody knew where he was. Well, the police got involved, and that night they searched with lanterns all up and down the beach, the cliffs, through the city. They talked to people in the city. His car was still parked at the stables. There was no way for him to get in and out without the car. Well, the search went on for 2 days. They found nothing, they saw nothing, they heard nothing, nobody had seen anything. That was it. Everybody presumed he drowned because there was no other way out, per se. The water seemed like that was it, especially since the hat was right next to the water. 5 months later, March 26, 1937, 3 a.m. A man comes pounding on the door to where John James Lucy lived and where his wife and family live now. The wife opened the door, and there's a man standing there, barely standing, near exhaustion, almost on his knees. And she looks at him, and she can't believe what she's looking at. She thinks she's looking at her husband, but she can't believe it. Well, he's wearing clothes that John would never have worn. He's wearing a hat he never would have worn. And he seems near collapse. So she brings the man in. She feeds him, gets him into a bed in the spare room, puts him to sleep. 2 p.m. that same day, he wakes up and he says, I have no idea how I got here. I have some memory about working in Spain on an ambulance in Malaga, possibly being in a hospital in Lisbon. Well, the wife calls the police, says, hey, I think I found my husband. Calls his business associates, calls the family. Nobody can believe it. Nobody can believe it, let alone John can't even believe he's here. The next day, a couple days later, the physicians that came to see him said he needs a couple days of no rest, no talking to anybody, just keep him close to the family, and that's it. On the 29th, 3 days later, he says more memory starts to be recalled. He said the last thing he remembers is falling from the horse on the beach twice. He said the first time he was able to pull himself up without falling completely. The next time he fell all the way up, felt a sharp pain in his head, and then remembers nothing. Says he's thinking he must have blacked out. The next day, March 30th, he thinks he remembers working on a passenger ship from Lisbon to Liverpool. And he worked it to gain the passage back to Liverpool. He says it was during those times that he started to get memories back of where he should be. He says he has no idea how he originally got to Spain. He says that puzzles him. In April 1937, it was a very slow recovery. One of his best friends came over to the house and decided to give him a ride around his town in an effort to institute some memory, some thought. And during the ride, he kept calling him John. And he stated, hey, my name's not John, it's Peter McCasserty. His friend didn't quite know what to think of that, because that's the first time he had heard it. But John's wife had heard that before. But there was no doubt. Friends, family, work associates all knew that, hey, this was John Lucy. Why he was kept pursuing Peter McCasserty was anyone's guess. He was still under a physician's care in late April 1937, and the last article stated that the physicians believed that John would heal eventually from his amnesia. Imagine having a husband for 17 years, which is how long they were married. And then sometime he comes home and he doesn't even know who you are, doesn't recognize the kids, claims his name is Peter McCasserty. It'd almost be like living with a stranger. It'd have to be odd. And it may even hurt to think that your husband you've been with for all these years doesn't know who you are. And I suppose in the back of your mind, you'd have to keep thinking, is this the truth? Is there something otherworldly going on? What's happening here? I don't know. But that was the first one. And I think that case is right on the money as far as a 411 case and an amnesia case. And since we're still on amnesia cases, how about one from a town I know something very, very much about? Man's name was Frank Leonesio. He was 47 years old, and he went missing June 9th, 1933 in the late evening hours. He was married, he had 2 sons, and he owned a grocery store on Mission Street in Santa Cruz, California, called Mission Handy Store. Frank was a native of Crescent City, California. Crescent City is one of the cities farthest northwest on the Pacific coast in California, right on the Oregon border, right near it. He moved to Santa Cruz in 1920. He had a very popular store. He was a member of the Knights of Columbus, and he was a Boy Scout executive in Santa Cruz County, and he was also a member of the Native Sons. He was definitely an integrative part of the community. Everybody knew him. Everybody liked him very much. This is Frank. At the time he disappeared, 47 years old. Now, on June 9th, he went to a meeting of the Native Sons. It was about 10 o'clock that the meeting was over. People at the meeting said that he seemed dazed. That's what their words said. And that he was going to go home. And everybody knew that when Frank drove home, he liked to drive along the coast. Look at the Pacific coast is gorgeous right there in Santa Cruz, I'll just tell you. And Lighthouse Point is right there where he just disappeared. And he liked to drive along that. Well, he didn't come home that night. Wife called friends, co-workers. Nobody knew where he was. Nobody knew what happened. Everybody confirmed he had left the meeting. Then, the very next morning, very early, a man named Paul Hilt. Paul was the caretaker of the Lighthouse Point campground. Now, Lighthouse Point is all blocked off. You can only walk up to the lighthouse and you look down at the water off cliffs and you can see Steamer's Lane where most of the time all year there's surfers there. Gorgeous. And you look across the bay and you can see the wharf, Santa Cruz Wharf. Now just west of there, Paul's checking out and making sure all the campers are good, and he looks west and he sees a car in shambles at the bottom of a cliff, half in the water with the waves hitting it. He says that's not right. Numerous articles said it was a 50-foot cliff. Other articles said it was a 30-foot cliff. But he called the police. Police come out and they identify the car as belonging to Frank. Frank's family was notified. There were no skid marks going off the cliff. It just looked like the car somehow managed to go off the cliff and into the water. So, this is Lighthouse Point. They're calling this Seal Rock right here, but everyone in Santa Cruz would call it Lighthouse Point. And there's a big lighthouse here. It's gorgeous. And you can look down and you can see Santa Cruz Wharf right here. And surfers are always surfing right through here on Steamer's Lane. There's a road that goes all the way around through here. It's a gorgeous drive. They never said where Frank lived, but I'm guessing he lived in this neighborhood right out here. Just a guess. How's it going, Doc? So, they find the car. They found a hat in the water. And they thought maybe Frank had somebody else in the car with him. Well, when the family found the hat, they recognized it as belonging to one of his son's friends who was in the car with the son the day earlier and just forgot to get the hat. So the hat was a byline that meant nothing. But the police and the fire department in Santa Cruz searched that bay water all day that first day. And when I read this, I kind of giggled because there's always a lot of kelp in this area. And there was a lot of kelp in it back then. And they made mention of it, and they said that what they were going to do is they were going to dynamite all the kelp. So if there was a body under the kelp being held under by the kelp, it would come up. I've never heard of that being done, but I thought that's marvelous. So they spent the next day dynamiting all the kelp beds in all the areas around the point, hoping that a body would come up. Police chief was interviewed, and he said a body should come up in 4 or 5 days. Well, it never came up. And nobody knew where Frank could have gone. He just had his family there. He wasn't a super wealthy man. He was hardworking day to day, running a store. Everyone believed he must have gone in the bay and drowned. And then November 1933, later in that same year, Santa Cruz Superior Court ruled that Frank was deceased. And the family needed that so that his wife could take over the business and make the payments, get the checkbooks in order, etc. So that was really no surprise. It had to be done. Well, that was November 1933. August 1942, 9 years later. Frank stated at this point he started to slowly regain his memory. He said that about this time he was running an ice cream business and helping in a grocery store in San Diego, California. And he was a member of the San Diego Lions Club. He was going by the name of Barney Castellina. He says he remembers something about a bad head injury, but he doesn't remember where, when, or how. A friend in San Diego told him that there were some really high-paying jobs at the San Francisco shipyard, but you needed a birth certificate to work on a federal project. Well, Frank said that it was in about that time frame he started to regain some parts of his memory, and he did remember that he was born in Crescent City. So he drove up thinking he's Barney Castellina, and he gets to Crescent City and people start to recognize him. And he's talking to him, and a series of people come up and say, "Hey, Frank, long time no see, where you living now?" And he was confused. And so many people came up and said that. He said, maybe that's my real name. Well, he got the birth certificate. And in September 1942, he got the certificate and applied for the job at the shipyard. In October, his memory kept coming back slowly, and that he was living in Santa Cruz came up. And he knew his name, and he started to dig into his name, and he found his family. His wife had moved the family to Susanville, California. It's where her family was from. Susanville was a remote area back then. That was way, way inland from far, far northern California. Well, Frank was told that he had some financial commitments that he had to make up in Santa Cruz. Frank was a good soul. He said, "I'll go back and I'll make it right. It was my fault." Well, his son said, "I'll go with you, Dad." And one of his sons was overseas, and it was a commissioned officer in the Army. The other one was still going to school, and his son that was still in school rode with him back to Santa Cruz. Frank stated that he has no memory at all of what happened on June 9th, 1933, or how he ever got to San Diego. Essentially, there's no memory of life between June 9th, 1933 and August 1942. With the birth certificate, he did get a federal job working at the San Francisco Naval Shipyard. There was never anything said about his wife that was living in Santa Cruz with him and him reconciling or getting together. But it sounded like his sons were all supportive of him. Now, one thing in both these stories, both these men, super hardworking. Both of them business owners, own their own business. Both of them family men. One man was 47, one man was 50. They essentially both disappeared in water. And in this last case, there's no memory for 9 years. How's that possible? Very hard to understand. Now, you've seen enough of these cases on truckers and amnesia now to start to see some of the associations. And with John James Lucy in 1936 and Frank Leonesio in 1933, just 3 years apart from each other, across the Atlantic from each other, but in essence, quite similar. Now, Frank travels from Santa Cruz, which is in the central coast of California, and he ends up on the southern coast down near Mexico. John Lucy goes from England all the way to Spain. How's that possible without travel documents? That's what I don't get. I don't understand that. But that's okay. That's why we're talking this out. And then also, he's possibly been in Lisbon, Portugal, in a hospital? I don't know. But do you notice how many cases are happening in the 1930s? And that's because there were a lot of cases in the 1930s. Compared to today, it's unbelievable how many there were. And then things started to change. Why is that? Well, I think we're going to learn more as we go forward in this series. And if you keep an open mind, and if you keep watching, and you keep sharing these videos, I would be forever grateful. And let's remember something. This is the kindness revolution. It doesn't cost anything to be nice to somebody. Volunteer your time. Reach out if somebody needs assistance. I'd be very appreciative of that. Thanks for being here. Paulides out.